The first sound was not the engine sputtering or the canopy shattering, it was the hammering. A metallic drumbeat that started somewhere behind and below grew impossibly loud, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Oberleutnant Franz Keller realized three things simultaneously. His Messerschmitt's left aileron was gone, the hydraulic lines were spraying red mist into the slipstream, and he had perhaps 30 seconds before the Americans came back to finish what they started. It was March 1944, and the sky over western Germany had become a slaughterhouse. Keller had launched that morning from a forward airfield near Kassel. His squadron scrambled to intercept yet another formation of American heavy bombers, grinding their way toward the Fatherland's industrial heart. The briefing had been short, almost perfunctory. 800 B-17 flying fortresses inbound. Fighter escort unknown, likely P-47 Thunderbolts. Engage the bombers, avoid the fighters if possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Avoid them, as if choice still existed in this war. Keller pushed the stick forward, diving toward the forest canopy below. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 responded sluggishly, its balance ruined by the missing control surface. Behind him, somewhere in the pale winter sky, those silver shapes were turning. He knew because he had seen them work before. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. 7 tons of American iron wrapped around a Pratt & Whitney radial engine that could push the fighter to over 400 miles per hour. But that wasn't what made them terrifying. It was the guns. 8 of them, 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The Americans called them Mar-Deuce. The Germans had other names for them, none of which could be spoken in polite company. Keller had watched a formation of Thunderbolts tear through his squadron 2 weeks earlier. The Americans hadn't even needed to maneuver. They simply lined up, flew straight, and opened fire. The sound was unforgettable. Not the sharp crack of cannon fire, but a deeper, industrial roar. Like a factory grinding metal, except the metal was his friends, their aircraft, their dreams of returning home. One burst had lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When it ended, 3 Messerschmitts were spiraling toward Earth, trailing fire and smoke. The P-47's armament wasn't revolutionary in concept. Wing-mounted machine guns had been standard since the late 1930s, but the Americans had taken the idea and scaled it to absurd, overwhelming proportions. Where British Spitfires carried 8 rifle-caliber guns and German fighters mounted 2 or 3 cannon, the Thunderbolt carried 8 50-caliber weapons with a combined ammunition load of up to 3,400 rounds. The mathematics of it were brutal. At maximum rate of fire, all 8 guns firing simultaneously could deliver over 9 pounds of lead per second into a target. The ammunition itself came in carefully calculated belts, mixing armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could punch through engine blocks, tracer rounds that showed the pilot where his fire was going, and standard ball ammunition that simply destroyed whatever it touched. The guns were harmonized, their barrels angled slightly inward so that all 8 streams of fire converged at a specific distance in front of the aircraft. Most P-47 pilots set their convergence between 800 and 1100 feet, creating a kill zone where the combined firepower concentrated into a space roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. At that range, a 5-second burst would put 500 rounds into that tiny target area. 500 rounds. 5 seconds, 3 feet by 3 feet. For a Luftwaffe pilot in a Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190, those numbers translated into a simple, horrifying reality. If a P-47 got you in its sights within effective range, you had about 8 seconds to live. 8 seconds to see the tracer fire arcing toward you. 8 seconds to realize your turns weren't tight enough, your speed wasn't sufficient. 8 seconds to understand that the machine hunting you was built specifically to do one thing better than any fighter in the sky: deliver overwhelming, catastrophic firepower. Keller had been trained to believe German engineering was superior. The Bf-109 he flew was, by many measures, an excellent aircraft. faster in a climb than most American fighters, more maneuverable in a tight turn, armed with a 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns that, in skilled hands, could bring down a bomber with a single well-placed burst. But training and reality had diverged somewhere around the time the P-47's started arriving in significant numbers. The Luftwaffe's advantage had been quality over quantity. Experienced pilots in well-designed machines could, the theory went, outfight numerically superior but less skilled opponents. That theory had worked in Poland, in France, even in the early days over Britain. It failed against the Thunderbolt for a simple reason. The Americans didn't need to outfight you. They just needed to hit you. And with 8 50 caliber guns throwing a wall of lead, hitting you wasn't difficult. The design philosophy behind the P-47 had prioritized firepower and survivability over maneuverability. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had built the Thunderbolt around the most powerful engine available, the 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp. To accommodate the engine's turbocharger system and associated ductwork, the fuselage had grown massive, giving the aircraft a distinctive, almost portly appearance. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, either for its resemblance to a milk jug when viewed from certain angles, or simply as shorthand for juggernaut. The nickname proved prophetic. What the P-47 lacked in agility, it made up for in sheer, brutal effectiveness. The radial engine had a high tolerance for damage compared to liquid-cooled designs. A 20mm cannon shell that would destroy a Mustang's engine might pass through a Thunderbolt's radial cylinders and leave it still flying. The aircraft's size allowed for heavy armor protection around the cockpit, and those 8 50 caliber guns could engage targets effectively at ranges where German fighters couldn't respond. Keller pulled out of his dive at treetop level, the Messerschmitt shuddering with the strain. His instruments showed oil pressure dropping. The engine temperature gauge was climbing into the red. He scanned the sky frantically, looking for the silver shapes he knew were up there, circling, hunting. The Americans had learned quickly how to use their advantages. Early in 1943, when the P-47 first entered combat over Europe, Luftwaffe pilots had exploited its weaknesses. The Thunderbolt climbed slowly compared to the Bf-109. It turned like a freight train. In a traditional dogfight, where aircraft twisted and rolled in close quarters, the German fighters could hold their own. But the Americans had adapted. New tactics emerged, developed by aggressive squadron commanders who understood what their aircraft could and couldn't do. Don't dogfight. Use your dive speed and your altitude advantage. Come in from above, make one pass with all guns firing, then zoom back up to altitude before the enemy can respond. If they try to follow you up, your engine power gives you the advantage. If they dive away, you're faster in the dive. And always, always, use those 8 guns. The P-47 pilots were trained to fire in short, controlled bursts, 2 to 3 seconds at a time, just long enough to walk the tracers onto target. But even a 3-second burst from 8 50 caliber guns meant 200 rounds in the air, 200 chances to hit critical systems, to shred control surfaces, to find the pilot sitting exposed in his cockpit. The convergence pattern was key. Unlike German fighters with their centrally mounted cannon firing along the aircraft's centerline, the P-47's wing-mounted guns created a cone of fire that narrowed to a point, then diverged again beyond the convergence distance. This meant there was an optimal killing range. Too close, and the 8 streams of fire were still separated, hitting different parts of the target. Too far, and they had begun to spread out again, reducing the concentration of hits. But at that sweet spot, that convergence zone around 1,000 feet, the effect was devastating. All 8 guns, all firing at slightly different angles, brought their fire together into a concentrated point of destruction. German pilots learned to fear that distance. If you saw a Thunderbolt at 1,000 feet, nose pointed at you, you had already. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He made a fatal mistake. The 50 caliber round itself was a marvel of destructive engineering. Developed near the end of World War I as an anti-tank weapon, It had proven too powerful for that role as tank armor thickened, but in the air, against aircraft built of aluminum and fabric, it was perfectly suited. The armor-piercing incendiary variant could penetrate nearly an inch of face-hardened steel at 200 yards. Against the thin skin of an aircraft, it punched through as if the metal weren't there at all. The incendiary compound added another dimension of lethality. A single API round striking a fuel tank could ignite the entire contents. The Germans had learned, painfully, that their fighters' fuel tanks were vulnerable. Self-sealing designs helped, but only if the round failed to penetrate completely. A 50 caliber API didn't fail to penetrate. It went through the tank, through the self-sealing rubber, and ignited everything along its path. Keller's squadron had lost 4 pilots that way in the last month. Clean kills from American fighters that had fired perhaps 20 rounds total. 1 burst, 1 fuel tank hit, 1 ball of flame falling toward Earth. The mathematics were terrible. 8 guns times 800 rounds per minute meant 6,400 rounds per minute of combined fire. In theory, in practice, pilots rarely fired all 8 guns continuously. The recoil was substantial enough to slow the aircraft slightly, the barrels heated rapidly, and ammunition, while abundant by German standards, was not infinite. Most P-47 pilots carried between 300 and 400 rounds per gun, depending on whether they were also carrying external fuel tanks or bombs. At maximum rate of fire, that gave each gun about 30 seconds of firing time. For all 8 guns firing together, 30 seconds total. But again, pilots didn't fire continuously. They fired in bursts, 2 seconds here, 3 seconds there, conserving ammunition for multiple engagements, making each burst count. The training emphasized fire discipline. Find your target. Close to effective range, put the gun sight pipper on the enemy aircraft. Squeeze the trigger for just long enough to see hits. Stop firing. Assess. If the target is burning or breaking apart, move on. If not, line up for another burst. This made the Thunderbolt's firepower even more frightening in practice than in theory. A skilled pilot with discipline and good aim could engage 5, 6, even 7 targets on a single mission before exhausting his ammunition. Each engagement might last only seconds. Each burst might be only 2 or 3 seconds long, but each burst represented 100 to 200 rounds of 50 caliber fire concentrated on a single target. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrines had no good answer for this. German fighters were trained to use their superior maneuverability to force the enemy into turning fights where skill and aircraft performance decided the outcome. But the P-47 pilots refused to play that game. They stayed high. They stayed fast. They made slashing attacks that gave their opponents no chance to maneuver. Keller had seen it happen to his wingman, a 20-year-old from Bavaria who had completed his training only 6 weeks earlier. The Americans had come out of the sun, 4 Thunderbolts in echelon formation. Keller had shouted a warning, but his wingman had been too slow to react, too inexperienced to recognize the danger until it was too late. The lead P-47 had opened fire at what looked like extreme range. Tracers arced across the sky, seeming to float almost lazily through the air. Then they connected. The Messerschmitt's engine exploded in a cloud of smoke and debris. The canopy shattered. The wings folded upward as if the aircraft were trying to embrace its own death. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 4 seconds. Later, after Keller had landed at a different airfield, his own base having been bombed, he learned the statistics. The Americans were claiming air superiority over Western Germany. Their bombers were flying in formations of hundreds, protected by fighters that could escort them all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Fuel shortages meant new pilots often arrived at combat squadrons with barely enough flight time to take off and land safely. The gap was widening. The Americans had numbers, they had fuel, they had aircraft rolling off assembly lines at a rate Germany couldn't hope to match. And they had the P-47, with its 850 caliber guns that turned aerial combat into a mechanized slaughter. Now, skimming the treetops with his damaged Messerschmitt, Keller understood that he had become part of those statistics. The Americans would call him a probable kill. His aircraft would be listed as damaged beyond repair. The war would continue without him, rolling inexorably toward its conclusion. He spotted a field ahead, relatively clear of obstacles. The engine was smoking heavily now, temperature far beyond safe limits. Landing would be rough with the missing aileron, but staying in the air meant certain death when the Thunderbolts found him again, and they would find him. They always did. The P-47's effectiveness went beyond mere technical specifications. It represented a different philosophy of warfare. The Germans had built fighters as precision instruments, designed to be flown by skilled pilots who could extract maximum performance through technique and experience. The Americans had built a weapon system designed to be effective in the hands of average pilots with average skill. This democratization of lethality proved decisive. A mediocre pilot in a P-47 could achieve results that would require exceptional skill in a lighter, more maneuverable fighter. The massive firepower compensated for imperfect aim. The aircraft's ruggedness allowed it to absorb damage and bring its pilot home. The long range, enabled by drop tanks and efficient engines, meant American fighters could go anywhere over occupied Europe. German pilots began to recognize the Thunderbolt's silhouette with the same dread that Allied airmen had once felt seeing ME 109 seconds. That distinctive razorback fuselage, later replaced by a bubble canopy that gave even better visibility. The broad wings with their 4-gun bays on each side, the massive radial engine that gave the aircraft its brutal, workmanlike appearance. When you saw a P-47, you had choices, all bad. You could try to run, but the Thunderbolt was faster in a dive than almost anything in the sky. You could try to fight, but fighting meant entering that convergence zone where 8 guns waited to tear you apart. You could try to climb away, but the American pilot would simply wait, maintaining altitude advantage, knowing you had to come down eventually when your fuel ran out. The psychological impact was immense. Luftwaffe pilots who had once felt confident in their place, aircraft and training now flew every mission, knowing that superior numbers and superior firepower could find them at any moment. The bravado that had characterized the early war years gave way to grim determination, then to fatalism. Keller brought his Messerschmitt down in the field, the landing gear collapsing on impact, the aircraft sliding sideways in a spray of dirt and grass. The engine finally died with a grinding shudder. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Above, he could hear engines, deep, powerful, unmistakable. The Thunderbolts were still up there, hunting. He pulled himself from the wreckage and ran toward the tree line, not looking back at the ruined fighter. Another loss for the Luftwaffe. Another victory for the Americans and their 8-gun killers. The war had turned into a calculus of firepower and numbers, and Germany was losing on both counts. The P-47, with its brutal simplicity and overwhelming armament, had become a symbol of that new reality. Every Luftwaffe pilot knew the statistics. 8 guns, 800 rounds per minute per gun, convergence at 1,000 feet. And somewhere in that mathematics, the answer to the question every fighter pilot asked himself: how long can I survive? For many, the answer was measured in seconds, 8 seconds, to be precise. The time it took for a P-47 pilot to squeeze his trigger, hold it steady, and watch his tracers find their target. 8 seconds for 50 caliber rounds to cross the distance between hunter and prey. 8 seconds for one war to end and another to begin. Keller reached the trees and kept running, the sound of those engines still echoing across the sky. Somewhere up there, American pilots were already looking for their next target, their fingers resting lightly on triggers that controlled enough firepower to change the course of battles. The Thunderbolt had arrived, and the skies over Europe would never be the same. First American pilots to fly the P-47's combat had been skeptical. When the 4th Fighter Group transitioned from Spitfires to Thunderbolts in early 1943, the complaints were immediate and vocal. The aircraft was too heavy, too large, too ungainly. Some pilots refused to fly it altogether. Coming from the nimble, elegant Spitfire to the 7-ton Jug felt like trading a sports car for a truck. Major Don Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th, listened to the complaints with thinly disguised impatience. He understood the concerns. The P-47 did climb like a brick, it did handle like a freight train at low speeds. But Blakesley had also seen the specifications, understood the mission requirements, and recognized something his pilots hadn't yet grasped. This wasn't a dogfighter. It was a bomber-destroyer and a fighter-bomber, and it would excel at both if flown correctly. The 4th Fighter Group's first combat mission with the P-47 came on March 10, 1943. 14 Thunderbolts, accompanied by 12 Spitfires, still in service with the group, flew an offensive fighter sweep over France. The Luftwaffe ignored them. No combat, no kills, no validation of the new fighter's capabilities. The pilots returned to base, convinced the aircraft was a failure. 5 weeks later, on April 15th, Blakesley scored the P-47's first aerial victory, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190. The kill was unremarkable in itself, one of thousands that would follow. But it marked a turning point. The Americans began to learn their aircraft, to understand its strengths, to develop tactics that played to those strengths rather than fighting against them. The learning curve was steep and written in blood. Early missions saw P-47 squadrons struggling against experienced Luftwaffe pilots who knew how to exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses, stay low, force them into turning fights, attack when they're slow and vulnerable during climb-out or approach to landing. The Germans were good at this. They had been fighting for years, their tactics refined through constant combat. But the Americans had one advantage the Luftwaffe couldn't match: resources. Aircraft production in the United States had reached levels that seemed impossible to German planners. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, was turning out Thunderbolts at a rate of hundreds per month. By 1944, production would peak at over 600 aircraft monthly. The Evansville plant added hundreds more. These weren't just replacement aircraft, they were improvements. Each new production block incorporated lessons learned in combat. Better engines, improved superchargers, additional armor where combat damage showed vulnerability. Most significantly, starting with the D model variants, a bubble canopy replaced the original Razorback design, giving pilots vastly improved visibility. If you could see the enemy first, you could dictate the terms of engagement. The ammunition mix evolved through experience as well. Early belts alternated ball, armor-piercing, and tracer rounds in set patterns. Armorers experimented with different combinations, looking for the optimal balance between penetration, incendiary effect, and visibility. Some pilots preferred heavy concentrations of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Others wanted more tracers to help walk their fire onto target. The standard belt that emerged mixed all types. For every 5 rounds, typically 2 would be M2 ball, 1 M8 armor-piercing incendiary, 1 M10 tracer, and 1 more API. This gave pilots the penetration needed to punch through armor and engine blocks, the incendiary effect to ignite fuel, and enough tracers to see where their fire was going without creating a constant stream that might give away position to enemy gunners. The weight of fire was staggering. 9 pounds per second was the theoretical maximum, but even practical burst firing delivered devastating amounts of lead. Pilots learned to fire in controlled bursts, but those bursts added up. A typical mission might see a P-47 pilot fire 200 rounds total, spread across 4 or 5 separate engagements. 200 rounds meant 25 rounds from each gun, or roughly 2 seconds of firing time per gun. 2 seconds doesn't sound like much, but spread across multiple targets, with 8 guns converging on each one, 2 seconds translated into catastrophic damage. German pilots reported seeing pieces of their aircraft simply disintegrate under 50 caliber fire. Wing surfaces shredded, tail assemblies separated from fuselages, engines exploded in clouds of oil and metal fragments. The Thunderbolt's ruggedness became legendary through incident after incident of aircraft returning from missions with damage that should have been fatal. Pilots came back with cylinders shot off their radial engines, the remaining cylinders still firing well enough to maintain flight. They returned with wings holed in dozens of places, control surfaces hanging by cables, canopies shattered by flak. One pilot, Lieutenant Edwin Wright, returned to base after a mission over Germany with a hole in his engine cowling large enough to climb through. Flak had struck the radial engine directly, destroying several cylinders and punching through to the firewall behind. The engine kept running. Wright kept flying. He landed safely, climbed out, and showed his ground crew the damage. They counted the 6th time Flak had hit his aircraft. He was 19 years old. The nickname Lucky stuck, though Wright himself downplayed the incidents. The aircraft, he insisted, deserved the credit. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters because its very size worked in its favor. A 20mm shell that hit a Thunderbolt might pass completely through without striking anything vital. The same shell hitting a smaller aircraft had nowhere to go but through critical systems. By summer of 1944, the P-47 had proven itself in multiple roles. High-altitude bomber escort remained important, but increasingly the Thunderbolts were being used as fighter bombers, carrying bombs and rockets in addition to their guns. A fully loaded P-47 could deliver 2,500 pounds of bombs, nearly half the payload of a B-17 Flying Fortress. With 8 50-caliber guns to suppress ground defenses during attack runs, the Thunderbolt became one of the war's most effective ground attack aircraft. The transition to ground attack brought new tactics and new dangers. Strafing runs required pilots to fly straight and level at low altitude, often through intense anti-aircraft fire. The Germans had learned to defend valuable targets with overlapping fields of fire from 20mm and 37mm flak guns. A strafing P-47 presented a relatively large, relatively slow target for a few critical seconds. But those same few seconds gave the Thunderbolt pilot a stable gun platform and a clear view of his target. The convergence pattern for ground attack was often set differently than for air-to-air combat. Some squadrons harmonized their guns to converge at 1,500 or even 2,000 feet, giving pilots more time to observe hits and adjust fire before pulling up. The 8-gun battery could destroy locomotives, trucks, armored vehicles, and parked aircraft with short bursts. The American 9th Air Force, supporting ground forces after the D-Day invasion, made the P-47 its primary fighter bomber. Squadrons operated from forward airfields in France and later Germany, flying close air support missions that brought them into intimate, brutal contact with enemy forces. Pilots could see the faces of soldiers they were strafing. They could watch their 50-caliber rounds impact trucks, see men running for cover, observe the destruction in real time. Tom Glenn, a P-47 pilot with the 9th Air Force, described the experience in terms that conveyed both the effectiveness and the horror of the work. The fighter-bomber pilot was a killer, he explained, not at a distance, not through indirect means. He saw his bullets tear bodies apart. He saw his bombs explode in gun emplacements, shredding equipment and men into fragments. He shot it out with anti-aircraft guns at point-blank range, and those encounters ended only when one side or the other was dead. The psychological toll was significant. Fighter pilots in the early war had spoken of aerial combat in almost chivalric terms. Duels between skilled opponents, fought at altitude where the earth below seemed abstract and distant. But low-level ground attack was different. It was intimate, it was bloody, and it was necessary. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the P-47's importance in this role. Hitler's surprise offensive through the Ardennes in December 1944 caught Allied forces off guard. German planning had specifically counted on winter weather to neutralize Allied air superiority. If clouds and storms kept the fighters grounded, German armor could advance without being subjected to constant attack from above. The plan worked initially. Thick cloud cover and snow prevented effective air operations for the first days of the offensive. But when the weather cleared, the Thunderbolts came out in force. 9th Air Force squadrons flew mission after mission against German columns, attacking tanks, trucks, supply vehicles, and troop concentrations. The Hellhawks, the 365th Fighter Group, engaged a German convoy on a road near Bastogne, 16 P-47 seconds, carrying 128 50-caliber machine guns combined, trapped approximately 50 trucks before they could escape into wooded cover. The attack was systematic and devastating. The Thunderbolts took turns, each flight rolling in to strafe while others circled overhead providing cover. The simultaneous fire from even 4 P-47 seconds meant 32 machine guns, over 25,000 rounds per minute of theoretical firepower. In practice, with disciplined burst firing, the actual output was lower, but still overwhelming. The heavy slugs, as one account described them, blasted trucks completely off the road and into ditches where they burned fiercely. What had begun as a chance encounter evolved into a marathon battle that continued as the Hellhawks hunted down every vehicle they could find. The Luftwaffe made one last attempt to challenge Allied air supremacy on January 1, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte launched nearly 1,000 German fighters and bombers in a surprise strike against Allied airfields on the continent. The attack was devastating initially, destroying over 200 Allied aircraft on the ground, including numerous P-47 seconds. But the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. German losses exceeded 300 aircraft, and more critically, experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe had husbanded its strength for this single massive blow, and the blow had failed to achieve its strategic objective. Allied air superiority remained intact. The Thunderbolts that survived continued flying, and production back in the United States ensured that losses were quickly replaced. For Luftwaffe pilots still flying in early 1945, the appearance of P-47 seconds overhead had become a death sentence. The quality of German pilots had declined precipitously. Fuel shortages meant training was cut to dangerous minimums. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with barely enough flight time to handle their aircraft safely, let alone fight effectively against experienced American pilots in superior machines. One German fighter pilot, whose testimony survived the war, described the mathematical reality with brutal clarity. From the second half of 1943 onward, he argued, a newly trained German pilot was a sitting duck for a newly trained American, one in a P-47 or P-51. The German lacked sufficient hours in type due to fuel shortages and had instructors who gained their experience in the Spanish Civil War or the first years of World War II. The American was trained by pilots who had seen combat 3 months before and knew exactly what worked and what killed you. In his squadron during 1943 and 1944, the veteran explained, the old hands accumulated kills while the newcomers died so quickly he didn't bother learning their names. The turnover was that rapid, the learning curve that steep, the margin for error that narrow. The experienced Luftwaffe aces, men with hundreds of combat missions and dozens of kills, could still be dangerous. They knew how to use terrain, clouds, and sun position to set up ambushes. They understood energy management and could sometimes force P-47 pilots into disadvantageous positions. But there were fewer and fewer of these aces, and they were fighting against impossible odds. Even the best German pilot faced a fundamental problem. American fighters appeared in numbers that couldn't be counted. A Luftwaffe pilot might successfully evade one P-47, might even damage or destroy it in combat. But there were always more. Flights of 4 became formations of 8, became groups of 16. The sky filled with them, silver shapes prowling at altitude, waiting for any German fighter that tried to interfere with bomber formations. The convergence zone became German pilots' recurring nightmare. That distance, roughly 1,000 feet, where all 8 streams of 50 caliber fire came together. If you found yourself in front of a P-47 at that range, with the American pilot's gun sight on you, your survival depended on split-second reactions and considerable luck. Brake hard left or right, dive for the deck, pull up into a climb that might stall you but might also throw off the American's aim. But the P-47 pilot had been trained for this. He expected the brake, anticipated the dive or climb. He knew to lead his target, to aim where the German aircraft would be rather than where it was. The gun sight helped, especially the later K-14 computing sight that automatically calculated deflection based on target size and range. Put the pipper on the target, match the ranging circle to the aircraft's wingspan, squeeze the trigger. The mathematics of ballistics did the rest. German pilots learned to fear the sound of impacts, not the initial burst, which they might not hear over their own engine noise, but the hammering of 50 caliber rounds striking metal. Each impact meant holes appearing in wings, fuselage, control surfaces. Each hole meant structural integrity weakening, systems failing, airflow disrupting. Enough holes and the aircraft stopped being flyable, started being a collection of damaged parts falling toward Earth in loose formation. The incendiary rounds added another dimension of terror. German fighters carried fuel in various tanks throughout the fuselage and wings. Self-sealing designs helped prevent leaks from small punctures, but they couldn't stop a 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round. When API rounds found a fuel tank, they didn't just puncture it, they ignited the contents. Fire in an aircraft was every pilot's nightmare. Seated in a cockpit, surrounded by fuel, ammunition and oxygen systems, with wind-feeding flames and no way to escape except by jumping into open air at high speed, pilots knew that fire meant death, or, if they were lucky enough to bail out, serious burns at minimum. The P-47's 8 guns increased the probability of catastrophic hits exponentially. It wasn't one round looking for a fuel tank, it was dozens, sometimes hundreds of rounds saturating the target area. Mathematical probability said that with enough rounds fired into a small enough space, something critical would be hit, and the P-47 fired more than enough rounds into spaces that were definitely small enough. Luftwaffe, after-action reports, when pilots survived to file them, described the effect of P-47 attacks in terms that emphasized the hopelessness of the situation. Aircraft coming apart in mid-air, wings folding upward, tail sections separating, engines simply exploding, all within seconds of the initial hits. The Americans, reports noted, didn't seem to maneuver much. They pointed their aircraft, flew straight, and fired. The simplicity was damning. This wasn't to say the Thunderbolt was invincible. German pilots did shoot them down, sometimes in significant numbers. Flak remained effective, especially at low altitudes where P-47 seconds flew ground attack missions, and experienced Luftwaffe fighters could occasionally ambush Thunderbolts, catching them at disadvantage, but the exchange ratio tilted heavily in America's favor. For every P-47 lost, German fighters lost 2, 3, sometimes 4 aircraft. And America could replace losses, Germany could not. The arithmetic of attrition was as brutal as the arithmetic of firepower. By spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Fuel shortages kept most aircraft grounded. The few missions that launched encountered overwhelming Allied air superiority. P-47 pilots reported seeing German fighters take off, struggle to gain altitude, then turn and run when they realized how outnumbered they were. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns had become symbols of that superiority. Every Luftwaffe pilot knew the silhouette, knew the sound of that radial engine, knew what it meant to see that distinctive shape lining up for an attack run. They knew they had 8 seconds, maybe less, to react. 8 seconds before the tracers started arcing toward them. 8 seconds before the hammering began. Some tried to fight. Training and duty demanded it, even when survival seemed impossible. They pointed their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at the American formations and opened fire with their cannon and machine guns, hoping for lucky hits that might disrupt the attack or down a bomber. Most died in the attempt, others ran. No shame in that, not anymore. Running meant maybe living to fight another day, though that day seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Running meant diving for the deck, using terrain to break line of sight, hoping the Thunderbolts had other targets, or limited fuel or orders that prevented pursuit. A few, a very few, survived through skill and luck combined. They learned to fight only when advantage existed, to avoid combat when it didn't. They became experts at recognition, able to identify P-47 formations from miles away and plan escape routes before the Americans even saw them. These survivors accumulated mission counts that seemed impossible. 50 sorties, 100, 200. Each mission meant another encounter with the Thunderbolt's 8 guns. Each survival meant beating odds that grew worse with every flight. The law of averages said that eventually, everyone's luck ran out. Eventually, you would find yourself in that convergence zone, with an American pilot's finger tightening on a trigger that controlled more firepower than an entire squadron had possessed just years earlier. The end, when it came, was often sudden. One moment you were maneuvering, evading, fighting. The next moment, impacts. The third moment, if there was a third moment, was usually fire or structural failure or both. The P-47's guns didn't wound, they destroyed. They turned aircraft into debris fields and pilots into casualties. The statistical record bore this out. American P-47 units claimed thousands of German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, thousands more destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. The numbers almost certainly included overclaims and duplicates, as all combat statistics did. But even conservative analyses showed exchange ratios heavily favoring the Thunderbolt. More importantly, the P-47 achieved its strategic mission. It protected bomber formations, allowing American heavy bombers to strike targets throughout German-occupied Europe and Germany itself. It provided close air support to ground forces, destroying German armor and vehicles that threatened Allied advances. It swept the Luftwaffe from the skies, making air superiority total rather than contested. The 850 caliber guns made all of this possible, not through technological marvel, though the guns themselves were excellent weapons, but through the simple, brutal application of overwhelming firepower. The P-47 could deliver more lead to more targets more consistently than any other fighter in the sky. That capability, multiplied across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of missions, changed the nature of aerial warfare. German engineers and tacticians studied captured P-47 seconds, trying to understand how the Americans had created such an effective weapon. The answer frustrated them because it was so straightforward. Take a powerful engine, build the largest single-seat fighter you can around it, arm it with as many heavy machine guns as the wings can hold, add armor and self-sealing tanks to keep the pilot alive, then produce it in quantities that make losses irrelevant. This was industrial warfare at its purest. Germany had bet on quality, on superior technology, and superior training, producing victory despite inferior numbers. America had bet on quantity, on acceptable technology, mass-produced to levels that made numerical superiority overwhelming. The P-47 embodied that philosophy. It wasn't the best fighter in any single category. But it was good enough in enough categories, and there were so many of them, that being good enough became being dominant. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 represented survival and lethality combined. They knew their aircraft would bring them home even after absorbing damage that would destroy lighter fighters. They knew their 8 guns gave them the firepower to engage successfully almost any target. They developed confidence, even affection, for the big, brutish jug that kept them alive and made them effective. For the pilots who faced it, the P-47 represented the mathematics of their own mortality. 8 guns, 800 rounds per minute per gun, convergence at 1,000 feet, 8 seconds from first sight of tracers to final impact. Those numbers defined the remainder of their lives, measured in missions that grew progressively more dangerous as German strength waned and American strength grew. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 sorties. Its pilots had claimed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft shot down. They had destroyed thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks, thousands of armored vehicles. The numbers told a story of dominance achieved through firepower applied consistently and in overwhelming measure. After the war, analysis confirmed what pilots on both sides had known. The P-47 had been one of the most effective fighter aircraft of World War II. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, not the longest ranged, but effective, deadly, reliable, everything a combat aircraft needed to be when victory depended on destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. The 50 caliber Browning machine guns that armed it continued in service for decades. The M2, in various forms, remained standard equipment on American military vehicles, aircraft, and ships well into the 21st century. Pilots who had flown against those guns, who had survived encounters with P-47 seconds, remembered them with respect that bordered on fear. You didn't forget the sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing at you. You didn't forget the sight of tracers converging on your position. You didn't forget the 8 seconds you had to live if you couldn't evade. In the end, the Thunderbolt's legacy was written not in innovation but in application. It took existing technology, the 50 caliber machine gun, and applied it at scale. 8 guns instead of 6 or 4. 3,400 rounds instead of a few hundred. A sturdy platform that could employ all that firepower effectively. The result changed aerial combat from skilled dueling to industrial-scale destruction. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried memories of those 8 guns for the rest of their lives. They had faced technological superiority before, had adapted to it, had learned to fight against it. But the P-47 represented something different. Not just technological advantage, but resource advantage so profound that skill and courage couldn't overcome it. When you saw a formation of Thunderbolts, you saw your own obsolescence made manifest in silver metal and spinning propellers. Some former Luftwaffe pilots, years later, attended air shows where restored P-47 seconds flew demonstration flights. They watched the aircraft perform, heard the distinctive sound of the radial engine, remembered. One pilot, grey-haired and thin, watched a Thunderbolt bank overhead and felt tears rise unbidden. That plane had once promised death, he explained. Instead, it had taught a lesson larger than war. That understanding could end conflicts faster than hatred could. That overwhelming force, properly applied, could shorten wars and save lives, even enemy lives. It was an uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless. The P-47's 8 guns had killed thousands, but they had also helped end the war in Europe months, perhaps years, earlier than it might have ended otherwise. Every month the war continued meant more deaths on all sides. Shortening that timeline, even through overwhelming violence, had value. The mathematics remained brutal. 8 guns, 50 caliber, 800 rounds per minute, convergence at 1,000 feet, 8 seconds. But perhaps, in the final analysis, those 8 seconds of terror had prevented years of prolonged suffering. Perhaps the Thunderbolts' massive firepower had served a purpose beyond simple destruction. Or perhaps it had just been war, conducted with the most effective tools available, without consideration for anything except victory. The pilots who flew the P-47 rarely philosophized about their missions. They had a job: destroy the enemy's ability to continue fighting. The 850 caliber guns let them do that job efficiently. Everything else was consequence. For the German pilots who faced those guns, philosophy was even simpler. Survive if you can. Fight if you must. Remember that you have 8 seconds, and use them wisely. Because once the tracers started flying, once the hammering began, once those streams of fire converged on your position, those 8 seconds were all you had left. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.